Hello all. We'll be discussing an important topic in managerial economics which is relating to demand. So before we move on to demand, we need to understand where this demand emanates from. Demand happens only if there is a presence of a market. Now market as such can be any place wherein you can trade your commodities. Now trade is a combined word for buying and selling. So market can be a physical place or a digital place. As you can see right now in the digital space, there is a lot of there are different types of markets. You have eBay, you have Flipkart, you have other markets. It is a digital space wherein you can sell your products or buy products from there. Similarly, you have your normal physical space, that is your traditional space, your normal markets that you can see. So all of these markets function to ensure that people get their goods and services, and there are people who have goods and services to sell. They can also sell their goods and services in the same place. Now demand is a situation wherein a person has the ability and the willingness to buy a specific quantity of a commodity at a prevailing price. There are certain conditions to be met if something needs to be called as demand. That is, a person should have the ability to buy, that is, he should have the amount or the money required to buy. Second, he should be willing to spend that amount. And the third is, he should be ready to spend that amount for a specific commodity at a prevailing price, and that too in a given period of time. Only if this happens, we can say that there is a specific amount of demand for a good or service. Now, if you move on to the next thing, so there are three different things to be specified in case of demand. The first thing is the desire to buy a commodity. The second thing is willingness to spend the money for it. The third thing is backed by sufficient purchasing power. So these three things should happen if you want a complete amount of demand. If you want to say that there is a specific amount of demand for a product, these three things should be combined. That is desire to buy a commodity, willingness to spend money for it, and it should be backed by sufficient purchasing power. There are different types of demand. The first demand is your price demand. That is which is caused due to change in prices. Okay. Now, what happens generally is, for example, whenever there is an increase in price of a product, so people would feel that the price of product has increased and the demand would proportionately decrease. And similarly, when people see that there is a decrease in the demand for price of a product, the demand would increase. So in that context, you can say that there is an inverse relationship between price and demand. So if you look at price can affect demand in a similar manner. For example, you can say that if there is an increase in price, there will be a decrease in demand. Similarly, there is a decrease in price, there will be an increase in demand. So it means that it is inversely proportional. That is, the price demand is inversely proportional to the price of a commodity or service. So whenever price increases, demand decreases. Whenever price decreases, demand increases. There is an opposite effect or an inverse effect. So that is why we call it a inversely proportional. Next thing, which is your income demand. So income is generally represented in economics parlance as Y. As Y. So this is, you do not represent it as I, you represent it as Y. Now for Y, what we generally say is whenever people have a higher amount of income, people will buy more, or in other words, the demand would be more. So whenever people have a higher amount of income, or if the income of a person increases, they would buy more, and if the income of a person decreases, people will buy less. This is a normal concept of having an income based demand. So whenever income increases, demand increases. Whenever income decreases, demand also decreases. Now there is an exception for the specific context, that is when you have inferior goods. Whenever you have inferior goods, for example, if I'm used to a very inferior good, I'm just going to use an example of rice that people get from ration depots. Now, if people are very used to the rice getting from ration depots because they cannot afford it, once they have a decent amount of income, they'll stop buying it. So normally when income increases, the demand for the product increases. But in case of products, inferior goods like rice that people get from ration depots, people will stop buying it because now they can afford better things. So there is an exception to this law. That is, whenever you say that income increases, similar demand increases, income decreases, demand also decreases. But there is an exception to it in case of inferior goods. If you have inferior goods, when the income increases, In spite of the fact that the person's income has increased, he will not go and buy more inferior goods. He will reduce the demand for the inferior goods and he will buy better things that he can afford right now. So that is specifically your income demand. Then you have cross demand. Now, cross demand happens when you have two related commodities. There's a classic example of tea and coffee. So whenever we look at it in this context, if there is a currently the price of coffee is more than price of tea, let's assume that the price of tea increases to a large extent. What happens is people will now switch over from tea to coffee. Now it is not the coffee's fault, or nothing has happened to coffee. But the only problem is the price of tea has increased so much that people are now forced to switch into coffee. That means the price of tea has gone up, which has resulted in a lower demand for tea. But at the same time, the demand for coffee has gone up. So it is cross demand. So because of two related goods, people can easily switch over to the other good. So the demand for the next easily relatable good would be higher in this specific case. Okay, so that is your cross demand. Then you have individual demand and market demand. For example, if you look at a single person's demand, if you're looking at my own demand, if I'm saying that every month I buy 10 kgs of rice, so this is my individual demand. Every person in Kerala must be buying some amount of rice. Now, if you combine this entire amount, it would be the market demand. So individual demand is only my demand. If you combine everybody's demand, it is the market demand. Then you have the joint demand. Some products are bought together, always bought together. For example, pen and refill, car and fuel. So if the demand for one product goes up, the demand for the other product will also go up. For example, if the demand for a car goes up, you can assume that the demand for fuel will also go up. Because as more people buy cars and scooters, the demand for fuel will also go up, because somebody needs to put fuel in it so that the vehicle can run. So obviously, whenever the demand for vehicles will go up, the demand for fuel will also go up. Then you have composite demand. Okay. Now, whenever some products have multiple uses, I'm just going to use an example of steel here. Okay. Now, if the price of raw steel or basic steel increases, okay, the price for all other things created using that steel will also go up. For example, you can look. There are several sectors that use steel. For example, you look at defense sector. You can also look at automobile sector. All of these sectors use steel. Now, all of those sectors or products in which you have a usage of steel, if the price of steel goes up, the price of the other commodities, related commodities, will also go up. That's resulting maybe in a lower demand for those commodities. That might happen. Then you have direct demand and derived demand. Okay, so sometimes you have this direct demand. Direct demand means there are certain, for example, here you have a natural desire to consume a particular product. For example, demand for food. So there is a direct demand for it. Okay, and people would always want to have that. In spite of whatever happens, that is their first priority. They will always like to have some food rather than anything else. So first of all, people like to survive. So that is your first come is your direct demand. And sometimes there is a demand for some other products. For example, the raw material as such does not have any kind of demand. The example given here is cotton fabrics. Okay. Now the cotton used for cotton fabrics or cotton cloth is generally does not used anywhere. People don't use it as a raw material anyway. They use it as a raw material but not as a final product. But if you require the other thing, if you require cotton clothes, you would always require this raw material. So if there is a higher demand for cotton clothes, the raw material required for it, that is basic cotton, would come and would have a higher demand. So that is your derived demand. That is the basic thing does not have a demand, but it is derived from somewhere else. That is the product that is created from that basic raw material has a higher demand, and because of that, this demand is also increasing. And there are certain determinants of demand. So why demand happens? So there are certain determinants. Certain determinants may be based on individual demand, and certain determinants will be focused on market demand. Now, determinants of demand, you start off with the basic price of commodity. Now, this is very similar to your price demand. Whenever price increases, demand for a commodity decreases. Whenever price decreases, demand for a commodity increases. Now, the next is price of related goods. Cross demand that we discussed earlier, tea and coffee. That is the example for it. Then you have income of consumers. This is very specific to the income demand. As income increases, demand increases. As income decreases, demand decreases. Then you have taste and preference of consumers. Now, this is something that we have not discussed before. Now, just assume people have developed a new taste for something. I'll just give you an example in this context. Now, in Kerala, many people are now focusing more, or they love to eat Arabic food. The problem is this is a newfound taste. So other foods like earlier, Chinese was very popular in Kerala, but people have now stopped eating it. Not stopped eating it, but the demand of Chinese food has come down, but the demand of Arabic food has gone up. This is purely not due to price. It is purely due to preference, and people have a new taste, or they have found out something new and they like it. They like it more than the other thing that they had. So there is a change in the taste and preference of consumer. So that is it. The next one is consumers' expectations. Sometimes consumers expect the demand to go up. For example, if you look at seasons or festivals, like for example, Onam. So you are assuming that the price of vegetables will go up during Onam because vegetables would be high in demand, everybody would want it. So you would assume that the price would go up. That is one reason for prices to go up. That is consumer expectations. And next is credit policy. Now, whenever you have better credit, for example, you go to a shop, shops that offer credit will get more sales, thereby having more demand. That is a very simple formula. You give credit, you have more demand. So if you want to increase demand, you need to give credit. So there are several shops that work on it. You can see several different shops. There are neighborhood shops who work on the same principle. They give credit, and because of that, they have higher demand. Now, next is your determinants of demand for your market. First thing is size and composition of the population. Everybody or every company on earth wants to invest in India. Why? Because we have a huge population. Higher the population, higher the demand. Next is income distribution. And the same context applies to India also. India is now slowly moving on from a poor country to a middle income country. Because of that, people will have more income and they can spend more. This is why all of these companies would like to come and invest in India. Then you have climatic factors. There are many factors. For example, if you have good climate and people want to work in there, because very severe climate does not attract people. If you look at it, many different countries give incentives to people to come and live in very remote areas. The classic example is Canada. If you look at many remote areas in Canada where people do not want to live, natives do not want to live, they offer these spaces to immigrants who want to go and live there, because that is the best place. They want that place to be populated because there is nobody's living there. So that is one factor. Because of that, there will be no sales, there will be no demand, and because of that, a severe climate, as you can see, does not generate a lot of demand. So if you have good climate, you have good demand. Then you have your government policy. Now, if the government is promoting more demand, giving more, let's assume lower interest rates, so there will be more demand. If the government does not want that to happen, it can curtail it. It is basically based on the government policy. So these are some basics of demand. Thank you.